All right. So we are now doing the first of the actual content lectures for the week, or for the course. And let me make sure I have up all of the relevant bits. Okay. So as the title indicates, this week we're talking about metaphysics. So, and a more specific topic within there. So to give you an idea, there are several normal, usual ways that philosophy is divided into sort of subtopics. Metaphysics is one of the primary subtopics historically. In contemporary philosophy, metaphysics is looked at by some as kind of outdated, having been replaced by scientific study. Now, why would that be? Well, metaphysics is supposed to be the philosophical study of existence, of the nature of existence, and also particularly which things actually exist. The second part, which things actually exist, is what's called ontology, whereas metaphysics is the more general questions about the nature of existence. So if you're ever faced with a question or you find some academic piece asking a question, what is the nature of X or do X's exist? Those are metaphysical questions. And, a philosophical answer to the metaphysical question, we'll look at how that goes. Largely today, in at least analytic philosophy, answers to these questions are taken to be empirical, that is, based on scientific explanation. What is the nature of X and does X exist? How do we determine that? Well, we do some experiments, we take some measurements, etc., etc. We do statistical analysis, and then we answer the question. That's a scientific approach to metaphysical questions. Obviously, a philosophical approach is going to be more centered around argumentation and logic rather than evidence and observation. And that will come out very quickly when we look at the arguments for today. So remember that what you're looking for, or from the thing that you're reading these arguments from, is this book. And for this week, the two things that I'm going to go over in the lecture, I'm going to go over, chapters 3 and 4, that is basically pages 22 through 26, right? So again, these chapters are very short, and as you'll see, that's because they're kind of dense. And we'll get through the nuts and bolts of argumentation as we go. So the title of today is Metaphysics, and in particular, we're talking about arguments concerning the existence of God. So in the history of at least Western philosophy, not so much in most Eastern philosophies, philosophy is very concerned with the existence of God and the characteristics that God has. And when I say God, for a great chunk of Western history, this does mean the kind of Abrahamic God of the Jewish, Islamic, and Christian faiths. But we can sort of extrapolate that and be a bit more general. We can say, well, it's about the nature of and the existence of divine beings. So let me inform you, if you don't know, that Western philosophy usually is taken to have its roots in ancient Greece, with particularly Plato and Socrates. And of course, Plato and Socrates lived in a time before the existence of the sort of Christian faith, and wouldn't have had much knowledge or contact with the Jewish faith. So they're talking about, when they say God, they're talking about Zeus, or they're saying gods, because they're talking about the various gods of the Greek pantheon, in whom, to a certain extent at least, Socrates and Plato believed, and which their contemporaries, the people, the society they lived in, definitely did believe. So when we talk about arguing about God's existence, the arguments we'll be looking at today are specifically about, capital G, God of the Abrahamic faiths, but we can extend that out a little bit. So the arguments concerning, capital G God, these start off largely in the Middle Ages, and they're very prominent starting in the Middle Ages, and essentially metaphysics is arguments about the existence of God. And sort of spun off from those arguments are arguments about the nature of existence itself and various types of properties. The more particular, specific metaphysical arguments talk about what's a property, how does one possess or manifest a property. All this other vocabulary starts coming out. So the strategies of argument that are being adapted by these Middle Age, medieval philosophers are strategies of argument taken from Plato and Aristotle. They're using this type of logical argumentation and they're adapting it to their own purposes. So these are often used in service of supporting theological views, right? So they're not purely theoretically motivated. They have a motivation, and that motivation is often the defense of particular theological views. At later points in philosophical and theological history, you talk about metaphysical debates concerning very obviously theological issues. For instance, about, well, how is it possible, what is the metaphysical account of the Trinity, right? So many Christian varieties of Christianity say that there are 3 parts of God or 3 different entities, but are somehow the same entity, right? So like 3 in 1. Not all Christian varieties of Christianity have believed that. So Unitarians, for instance, did not. They say there's only one thing. And Trinitarians say, well, there are 3 things, but it's kind of the same. Those are metaphysical questions which are also kind of hashed out, or excuse me, theological questions which are hashed out in the terms of philosophical metaphysics. We're not going to get into all that. This isn't a history of religion course or theology course, but just to give you an idea of why these arguments are so prominent in the history of Western philosophy. So some stuff before we get into that that's not in the chapters. I want to go over some kind of general ideas, general terminology concerning metaphysics and the existence of divine being. So here we are generalizing. We're not just talking about capital G God, we're talking about divine beings like the ancient Greeks might have believed in, so on and so forth. And there are 4 general types of position one can have, right? And so this is about the question, do divine beings exist, right? So remember, the kind of generic form of one metaphysical question was, do X's exist? Are there any X's? So here X is just divine beings. Are there any divine beings? And so we can kind of provide 4 different answers, 4 different types of answer to that question. You'll be familiar with at least 2 of these terms, definitely. Probably 3, but not all 4. The first 2 you'll be familiar with, I'm almost positive, theism and atheism. And these define 2 well-known positions with respect to the question, are there any divine beings? Theism says, yes, it answers in the affirmative. There are divine beings. So if you, for instance, believe in God because you're Jewish, Christian, Islamic, then you say, yes, there is a divine being, and then you'd specify, and actually there's only one of them, and it has these qualities. If you were an ancient Greek, or if you're a person who participates in some religious, spiritual community that believes in more than one divine being, you would say, yes, there are this many of them, here's a list of them, here's what they do, what they're like, right? But so being a theist in this general sense is a very generic answer. All it says is, yes, there are divine beings. It doesn't tell you anything about them, how many of them there are, what they're like. Atheism, on the other hand, in a sort of general sense, is answering no to the question of whether there are divine beings. So this is a bit more united than saying yes, right? Because no means no, there aren't any, not of this ancient Greek variety, not of this Christian, Jewish, Islamic variety, not of this sort of whatever perhaps pagan tradition, talking about none of those exist, not one, right? So the way we're framing these positions, theism is a kind of general answer which you would then specify further depending on the particular community of faith or spirituality that you're in. Atheism is just a straight up denial. No, there aren't any of those things. And the interplay between those two takes up a lot of space in our public, religious, intellectual discourse. Of course, it's usually centered around the Abrahamic conception of God. Does that exist or does it not? Atheists do occasionally talk about the fact that they are also denying all these other, non-Christian, non-Jewish, non-Islamic conceptions of God, but that doesn't get as much airplay. So you're familiar with those terms, to be sure. Agnosticism, you may have heard, you may be familiar with, but you probably, likely, have a different conception of it than the one that we will operate with. So agnosticism is not merely being undecided, it's not being apathetic, it's another settled belief, right? So theism and atheism, we're considering settled beliefs. You believe something, you have reasons for it, and it's a full-out belief. Agnosticism, in this kind of full-out sense, means that you hold the belief that the existence of God, or the answer to the question, are there any divine beings? Well, there isn't an answer at the moment. And there isn't an answer because the relevant evidence is indeterminate. It doesn't tell you one way or another. We don't have enough evidence. You might even say the nature of this question is not determinable, right? There is no evidence you could ever find that would settle it one way or the other, okay? So that's why I put it this way. The belief that it is not or cannot be known, right? That it is not known would be to say, well, look, the evidence we have, it just doesn't say. Could be one way or the other. Maybe eventually we'll have the right evidence and there can be an answer to this question. The belief that it cannot be known or proven is the idea that there's something about this question, there's something about human beings such that we will never know for sure, right? So there are two different strengths of agnosticism here. And so when we're talking about settled agnosticism, this is what we mean. We're not talking about people who don't care or who are just sitting on the fence. We're talking about something a bit more motivated than that. Finally, non-theism is probably a term with which you're not familiar. I didn't make it up. You will find it here and there in some debates about or discussions of religious history. What does it mean? Well, a non-theist would be a person who says, to an extent, I don't care whether or not divine beings exist. For the particular purpose at hand, it doesn't matter. So Buddhism, the ancient variety, is traditionally taken to be non-theistic. That is, somewhere in the sayings of Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, he says something to the effect of, look, why are you wasting your time debating the existence of gods, whether they exist, what they're like? All that stuff, the answer to those questions has nothing to do with how you should live your life, right? So what Buddhism puts forward is what we would call ethical or moral non-theism. It says, with respect to questions about how you ought to live your life, what is right and wrong, the existence of gods or God doesn't matter at all. Okay? They could exist, they could not exist, and it wouldn't change what you need to do with your life, what it counts, what it does, what amounts to a good life. So that's a version of a non-theistic perspective. For the most part, philosophical ethics is largely non-theistic. A utilitarian ethicist, someone like Peter Singer, won't appeal to the existence of God. Peter Singer is, I'm almost positive, an atheist, but his atheism has nothing to do with his philosophical, ethical position. He says, look, the utilitarian says, the greatest happiness for the greatest number, that's what makes something good or bad. You don't have to mention God really in there. So that's what non-theism is. And so these are the four general positions that you can sort of inhabit with respect to the existence of a divine being. Now, going back to the more specific question, capital G God, when you look at the different metaphysical arguments throughout history that exist in favor of, in support of the existence of God, they fall into these three categories: ontological arguments, cosmological arguments, and teleological arguments. And these are sort of philosophical jargon, and I explain them here. An ontological argument, so I remember I said the word ontology earlier, ontology being about which things actually exist and what they're like. Ontological arguments support the existence of God, as I say here, on the basis of God's essential characteristics. So they say, well, here are some characteristics that if God exists, God must have, and blah, 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 God exists. And we will look at ontological arguments today. Those are the two that are sort of featured in the book, or that we'll look at from the book. Cosmological arguments are arguments, well, actually, the first argument we're going to look at is a cosmological argument. They argue from the existence of the universe, right? They say, well, here's the universe. We're sure that it exists. And because we're sure that it exists, blah, 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 God must also exist, right? So they support the existence of God on the basis of providing an explanation for the existence of anything at all, right? And you'll be familiar, you may not have heard this argument sort of as an argument, but you'll be familiar with the kind of reasoning behind it once you see it. The first argument is very, very short and very clear, and it will be obvious what the logic behind it is. Finally, teleological arguments are the ones with which you are probably most familiar because they're the ones that actually are sort of bandied back and forth in the public discourse about the existence of God, the public discourse between theism and atheism. So a lot of play is given to intelligent design arguments, and that's a version of a teleological argument. And so these sort of arguments attempt to support the existence of God on the basis of features of the universe which require an intelligence, some greater power to have put them in place. Things which allegedly could not have blindly developed on their own just by the random operation of sort of mechanical forces. That's what teleological arguments are. And they are very prominent, not so much in the Middle Ages, but later on, once the kind of the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment occur, you start to see intelligent design arguments pop up. And of course, you see critiques of those intelligent design arguments as well. We will only cover an ontological and a cosmological argument today, and not a teleological one. So ontological, ontology is about things existing, items that exist. Cosmological, like the word cosmos, cosmos just means order in Greek, basically. And so cosmological arguments are arguments on the basis of the sort of ordering of the universe. Teleological has to do with purpose, with direction. So something's teleology is its purpose, and that's the root of the word there. Okay, now on to the stuff that's actually from the book, the arguments that we're going to cover. The first one is called the Kalam Argument. It's not associated with a particular person, but with a particular type of Islamic theology. So when I say here that the Ilm al-Kalam tradition is a system of Islamic apologetics, and apology in scholarly terms is not referring to saying, oh, I'm sorry that I did this. It's defending something, right? So apologetics are defenses of, usually, religious traditions. The word, an apologetic can be used a bit more broadly than that. You'll occasionally see it in think pieces, but not very much. So you have to sort of, excuse me, as is often the case when you're dealing with philosophical scholarly jargon, you have to take a step back from your usual understanding of the word and add in a different definition and make sure that you keep that different definition in mind when you're reading, when you're interpreting. So Islamic apologetics, Christian apologetics, Jewish apologetics, this would all be arguments in defense of some feature of one of those faiths, right? So here, as I say, the Ilm al-Kalam tradition is a system of apologetics in defense of Islamic religious doctrines from their critics. And this is not just from external criticisms from, say, the Jewish community that existed around the time of the Ilm al-Kalam tradition, but also internal criticisms, right, from different sects of Islamic belief at that time. And this is, again, a sort of Middle Ages phenomenon. So when I say at that time, the Middle Ages, roughly something from like, the 11th century BCE to the 12th, 13th century BCE. It's a span of 200-300 years. Okay, so as I said, this argument, this is in the textbook, chapter 3 of the textbook, it is incredibly short. There are two premises and a conclusion. And this is, as I said, a cosmological argument. What does that mean? That means that it is an argument focused on supporting the existence of God on the basis of explaining the existence of the universe. So, it's saying, hey, whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe is something that began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a cause, and then, in parentheses, that cause is God, right? This argument is a little bit non-specific. It doesn't get us directly to the conclusion that there is a God, but that's its intention. So the way that I'm going to format these lectures where we go over an argument, I'm going to present the argument in its premise conclusion form, and then I'm going to go into analyzing smaller parts of it, giving you criticism, so on and so forth. So I've said this word premise and conclusion. This is going to be very important to know what this means. It's fairly obvious, but because we're just at the beginning here, I want to make sure that I don't assume anything, that I don't skip over anything. I go through it kind of slowly and methodically. So our first interlude, we're going to stop talking about the argument in question in particular and go to something more general about logic and argumentation. Anything that says P with a number beside it, that's a premise. So when I say an argument in premise conclusion form, I'm talking about this sort of numbered list of statements and then indication of the connections between those statements. When we refer to a premise, we refer to something that is an assumption, it's an already established fact, it's a rule of inference, and these are supposed to be independently plausible. They don't depend on the conclusion of the argument that you are engaged in at the moment. If one of your premises does depend on the conclusion of the argument that you are currently making, that's a logical fallacy. It's called circular argumentation. It's bad. Don't do it. Premises can also be intermediate conclusions, right? So I have this note at the bottom. So when you see P number, we're talking about a premise. When you see C number, that's a conclusion. And conclusions are the statements which follow from premises. So you take two premises together, the connection between them kind of spits out a conclusion, right? So premise 1 and premise 2, these two things taken together are supposed to result in, spit out the conclusion, okay? And we'll see how that works in a bit. And then, of course, a conclusion can then, once it's established, once you say this conclusion is demonstrated, you can then use that conclusion as a premise in another argument because, well, it's independently plausible, it is now established. You can use it to do whatever you want, right? Okay, so because it's a short argument, we can look at each of its premises, in some amount of detail. We don't have to skip any of them. So the first one says, whatever begins to exist has a cause. So when you are making an argument or when you are analyzing someone else's argument, you have to look at each premise and see whether it is in fact plausible on its own, or whether it is demonstrated by earlier premises and conclusions. So in a short argument like this, all the premises are supposed to be self-evident, obvious, uncontroversial, something like that. Whatever begins to exist has a cause is supposed to be one of those self-evident things. It's supposed to be just obvious to everyone. And so if something at one point didn't exist and then starts to exist, then something made it start to exist, right? When I say something, there's a reason, a cause that made it such that it came into existence. So my example here, the house on the hill did not exist in June. Then the house on the hill did exist in August. There is a cause for the coming into existence of this house, and that cause, or one of the causes, is the construction crew, right? Why did the house on the hill come into existence? What caused it to be built? Well, the construction crew caused it to be built. It's that kind of reasoning, just fairly normal. Whenever we see something, how did that get there, you ask, of some package on your front door or your front step. Why isn't there any, why isn't there any juice in the fridge? You're asking questions about what caused something to come into or go out of existence. And that's all that's kind of being pointed at here, is that we always think that there is a cause for something when it begins to exist. The universe began to exist. Well, I mean, again, this is supposed to be self-evident. At one time, there wasn't a universe, and then there was one. Okay, there are plenty of creation stories throughout all kinds of cultures, and so they often, although not always, have this idea that first there was nothing and then there was something. Well, when things come into existence, the idea is something had to make that the case. So if the universe wasn't there and then it was, something made it come into existence. Now, of course, as I say, not all creation stories are like that. And so, well, we'll get to that in a minute. There's a sense in which this isn't necessarily obvious. So finally, we have a conclusion, right? So the conclusion is not self-evident. Conclusions are never self-evident. Conclusions are supposed to be made evident, to develop from, to, again, as I've sort of used this metaphor, be spit out of the premises. So it is meant to logically follow from premises 1 and 2. So how does that work? Premise 1, as I say here, states a principle which claims that if something has a particular property, having begun to exist at some point, then it also has another distinct property being caused. So it's stating a rule. It's saying if something, anything at all, has come into existence ever, then that same thing has the property of having been caused by some distinct thing, right? So we've sort of, without explicitly saying so, ruled out things causing themselves, right? No self-caused things. We've said that if something comes into existence, then a distinct object or entity caused a distinct second object or entity caused that first one to come into existence. That's not explicitly in the premise, but it's implicit there, right? Otherwise, the argument doesn't work, okay? Well, I mean, otherwise, the argument doesn't achieve what it's meant to achieve. There's a whole bunch of little subtleties that we won't go into because they're not terribly important for our purposes. Today, this week, we're just trying to get into the habit of looking at arguments in this format, evaluating them, seeing whether they work, how they're supposed to work, in what ways you can criticize them. That's all we're concerned with this week. So we don't want to worry too much about all the little subtleties. Okay, so premise 1 states a rule, a principle. Premise 2 just states a fact. So the first one says, if anything at all has come into existence, then that thing which has come into existence was caused by something. The second premise says, here's a thing that came into existence, the universe, right? It's just stating that, stating a fact. And this will be a very familiar pattern in the arguments that we go through. You have what's called a conditional and if-then statement, which has two parts. then a specific instance is stated, which is kind of, a version of a piece of the first premise, and then we get to conclude the second piece of that first premise. That's very vague, but we'll explain it as we go along. So the universe has at some point this particular property of having begun to exist. Now, because the universe has this property of having come to exist, you plug that back into the first principle, and it says, well, anything that has that property that the universe has also has this other property. And therefore you conclude that the universe has this second property because it has this first one. That's all there really is to the argument. So again, this explanation of it might make it seem a little bit more complicated than the 3 lines that we first looked at, but there is a lot you have to understand to see how these 3 lines fit together. Okay, so that's why you can write a page upon page of full paragraphs about something that can be, in some sense, boiled down to 3 lines. And this kind of reading between the lines, so to speak, is one of the skills that we're practicing in this course. Okay. So here's another interlude. When we talk about arguments, there are 2 important properties that we're looking for to determine whether an argument is good or bad, right? So a good argument is at least valid and hopefully sound, right? What does this mean? Well, valid is a word that you're used to using in the context of evaluating statements and arguments. When you say that something, oh, that's a valid point, you mean it's a good point. Oh, that's a valid argument, it's a good argument. We have a very specific meaning in premise conclusion arguments for the word valid. Only arguments can be valid, right? A single statement cannot be valid, right? So the idea that that point, that statement is valid, that doesn't work for our purposes. Only the entire argument is valid. What does that mean? Well, an argument is valid if all its premises were true at the same time, then, because of that, its conclusion would also have to be true. Okay? So going back here, a valid argument is such that if P1 and P2 are true at the same time, then them being true at the same time guarantees that C1 must be true. Okay? If an argument is valid, that's what it does. Now, an argument in which the premises are actually true and is already a valid argument, that argument is sound. Okay? So an argument can be valid without being sound, but it cannot be sound without being valid. Okay? So going back to here, this argument is valid, or we're going to assume that it is for our purposes, if it's true that whatever begins to exist has a cause. And if that's true at the same time that the universe began to exist is true, the truth of these 2 things together guarantees the truth of the conclusion that the universe has a cause. There are a lot of ifs in there, right? Stating that an argument is valid doesn't tell you whether any of the premises of the conclusion are true in the real world, right? It's giving you this sort of schematic for arguments. You then have to figure out whether or not the premises are true. If it is true that whatever begins to exist has a cause, and it is also actually true that the universe began to exist, then it is actually true that the universe has a cause. Okay? So when you sort of replace those ifs with actually, then you sort of get a sound argument instead of merely a valid argument. So what would an example be of an argument which is valid but not sound? Well, I mean, this could easily be one, right? It could be that the universe didn't begin to exist. So there are certain creation stories which say the universe has always existed. It's always been there. It never started. It's eternal. It is without beginning, without end. So that would mean if those creation stories have right, the way the nature of the universe is, then the universe never began to exist. And so, although this argument is valid, the conclusion isn't true because the universe didn't begin to exist. And so things which don't begin to exist don't have causes. Okay? So that's that would be how that one way this could be valid but not sound. What does an invalid argument look like? Well, I can give you a simple example. Socrates is a human being. All dogs are mortal. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. That argument is not valid. Why? Well, because it can be true that Socrates is a human being, and at the same time, it can be true that all dogs are mortal, but that doesn't get us to the conclusion that Socrates is mortal. For all we've said in that argument, humans might be immortal and live forever. Now, that's not actually true, but that's irrelevant. We have to work with what the argument has given us, right? So when you are evaluating the validity of an argument, you cannot look outside of what's written on the page. You look at the argument as stated. Now, it may be that you could make the argument valid by supplying another premise, right? But if the argument itself doesn't state that premise, then the argument itself, again, as stated, is no good. So if we were missing a premise here in the Kalam argument, then it would be invalid. We'll be revisiting this over and over again, so if it's not clear now, hopefully it will become clear as time goes on. Also, valid and sound, those terms are both in the glossary. You can look at them. There are other examples written down. So if you can't really catch it in the spoken form, go visit the glossary for the course page and then look over it there. If you still have trouble understanding it, you can please do send me an email, come to my office hours or something. Okay, so let's revisit this. Excuse me. We're going to sort of treat the Kalam argument as valid. So the argument is valid, and what it does is it operates by the modus ponens principle of formal logic. What does that mean? That's some Latin logical jargon. Modus ponens is a form of argument which proceeds as follows. If P, then Q. P, therefore Q. Right? So 1, 2, and 3 here are the steps of the argument. Premise 1, premise 2, and then conclusion. And as you've already probably guessed, this corresponds perfectly to the argument as we've already written. Premise 1, premise 2, premise 3. So we can reformat this. We can plug in the bits of the Kalam argument that we already have, and then we can see, so in place of if P then Q, we have something more specific. If something begins to exist, that's if P, then that thing has a cause, then Q, right? The universe began to exist, so that's what goes for P here. So now we have if P, then Q. Well, we do have P, right? That's sort of provided to us by 2. Well, that means, according to modus ponens, that if we have the first statement and then we demonstrate this first part of the first statement, we can just conclude this second part of the first statement. Let me go into the annotation thing, right? Let me see if this is going to work. So here is the first part of the statement. Here is the second part of the statement. So modus ponens says that you're stating a connection between 1 and 2. It's saying if you get 1, then you get 2. And then in the second part we're saying, hey, we do have 1. And because we've said earlier, if you have 1, then you get 2, and we have 1, we can therefore say, hey, now we get 2. Okay? We can plug that in. If something begins to exist, then that thing has a cause. Well, the universe in particular began to exist. Oh, great. Therefore, we now know that the universe is one of those things that has a cause, right? So again, 1, 2, there's a connection between those. This is saying, hey, 1. And then we get to say, oh, okay, well, because 1, then 2. I don't know if those exclamation marks are remotely helpful or if this annotation is helpful at all, but hopefully it kind of is. Okay, so modus ponens is a general argumentative form which you are going to see 5 million times in the course of our discussion. So if you don't get it quite right now, don't worry about it. I'm going to say the word modus ponens so many times that you're going to be sick of it. I mean, you're probably already sick of it. Okay, so that is the form, the logical form of the Kalam argument. All right, so we said once you establish that something is valid, well, that doesn't mean that its conclusion is true in the world, right? We know that given certain circumstances, then the conclusion is true in the world. So now we have to figure out whether those circumstances obtain, whether the circumstances themselves are true in the world. So we have to ask 2 questions. Does everything that began to exist have a cause, and did the universe begin to exist? If the answer to either of those questions is no, then the Kalam argument, even though it's valid, isn't sound and therefore doesn't tell us anything about the world. Doesn't tell us anything about the nature of the universe. So an unsound argument demonstrates nothing about the way things actually are, even if the argument is valid. So a valid argument is good in some way, but simply because an argument is valid, simply because it has the right logical form, doesn't mean it tells you anything about the way things are. And that's very important to realize. People who sort of are half initiated into the way of argumentation and logic, they often say, oh, I have a valid argument, therefore, I am right. No, that's not the way it works. You can spout valid arguments all day and they can tell you absolutely nothing at all. For instance, here's a valid argument that's mostly gibberish. If April is the cruelest month, then the moon is made of cheese. April is the cruelest month. Therefore, the moon is made of cheese. Well, you now know absolutely nothing more than you did 10 seconds ago about the way the world is. The moon is not made of cheese, despite the fact that I gave you a valid argument to the effect that the moon might be made of cheese. The moon isn't made of cheese because April isn't the cruelest month, because that's gibberish. Months aren't cruel or uncruel. That's not the right kind of thing to use to describe months. So creating a valid argument is kind of, I don't want to say it's easy, but validity is cheap, right? It doesn't do much for you. Only validity combined with soundness tells you much of anything. So we won't go into whether or not the answer to these 2 questions is yes or no. I've already given you some indication about how you might answer no to the second question. We won't get into answers to the first question, except to say I gave you one hint, not necessarily that the answer to this first question is no, but that actually this question might not be fully specified. Does everything that began to exist have a cause? The answer to that question could be yes, even if things could cause themselves, right? But that's not a conclusion that the argument is willing to countenance. It means anything that began to exist was caused by something else. So there's a little bit more that we'd have to do that argument to fully flesh it out and fully criticize it. But I've gone on for quite a long time about this argument, and we have another longer argument to get through. So let's move on to that second argument. This is the ontological argument of Anselm. Anselm's ontological argument is almost the ontological argument. It gets a lot of play in introductory philosophy classes and in sort of scholarly philosophy articles as well. It's been discussed for many hundreds of years. And Anselm himself and those people that he affected, that he influenced, I should say, are credited with the development of kind of logical argumentation in both religious and philosophical thought in Europe. Right? So not only is this particular argument influential, but Anselm's methods in general are very influential in the history of Western philosophy. And so he himself was, Saint Anselm. That tells you he's a Catholic or an Orthodox Christian, but he's Catholic, and he's a monk of the Benedictine order. Doesn't really matter what that means for our purposes. So now we're in chapter 4. This argument is quite a bit longer, right? So we have 2 pages of premises and conclusions, and you'll see we have multiple conclusions, right? So the final conclusion is C4 here. All of the things labeled C before that are what we call intermediate conclusions. And intermediate conclusions are used as premises at some point to get to the final conclusion. So let's just read through these here. Premise 1. God is something than which nothing greater can be imagined. And that's really hard to say and somewhat difficult to understand at first, but let's just go through it at the moment. P2. Existence in the understanding and existence in reality are 2 separate things. P3. Existence in reality is greater than existence in the understanding. And so P3a is an explanation, an elaboration of P3, which says something existing in reality is greater than something that only exists in the understanding. P4. Even the fool understands the concept of something than which nothing greater can be imagined. So at this point, you may feel insulted by the argument since it says everyone understands this complicated phrase, but you at the beginning might have thought, what on earth does that complicated phrase mean? Don't worry about it. If something is understood, then it exists in the understanding. Here we have our first intermediate conclusion. Something than which nothing greater can be imagined exists in the understanding. P6. Something than which nothing greater can be imagined exists, not can exist. This should just say exists. Exists only in the understanding. P7. It is greater for something than which nothing greater can be imagined to exist in reality than for it to exist just in the understanding. Conclusion 2. There is something greater than something than which nothing greater can be imagined. C3. Something than which nothing greater can be imagined cannot exist only in the understanding. It must also exist in reality. C4, God exists. That's a big jump, right? When you look in the textbook, there are a few more annotations to these premises, little parenthetical remarks, which make some of the transitions a bit clearer. We will discuss those in the subsequent slides. Okay, so that was a lot of premises and conclusions. And there's this phrase which recurs, something than which nothing greater can be imagined. What on earth does that mean? Let's get to that. So, ontological arguments, if you recall from the very beginning, are arguments which support the existence of God on the basis of its essential characteristics. Okay? So, that sort of leads up to this speculation about what the characteristics of God are, right? And there's a lot of theological discussion throughout, the existence of Christianity and Islam and Judaism, which try and ascribe various properties to God, right? Now, of course, if you needed to have an argument which listed all of those, and if God has a whole bunch of properties, well, then that argument's going to be interminable. It's never going to end. You have this whole list of things. God is X, God is Y, God is Z, and you're going to have to somehow demonstrate that. One of the sort of this brilliant maneuver in Anselm's argument is to condense that possibly infinite list of God's characteristics into a single descriptive phrase. So the idea is, well, sure, God probably has a whole bunch of real great characteristics. We could list those, or we could just say, God is the greatest thing that you can imagine. So something than which nothing greater can be imagined just means it's a definition of God which says there is nothing greater than God. Not just that there is nothing actually greater than God, that there is nothing possibly greater than God. Nothing you could even coherently think of would be better than God. That's what something than which nothing greater can be imagined means. It means that God has all of the best properties to the greatest extent, and there is no other thing which both has all those properties to the same extent. There's nothing better than God. That's all it means. Why is it phrased that way? Well, because this is this is written in probably Latin, a couple hundred years ago, and translated into English. And one thing that you'll notice about these logical arguments, these deductive arguments that we're dealing with, they are very repetitive in their phrasing, and that is important. It is important that the same phrase or same word appears in similar circumstances throughout the entire argument, so that you don't accidentally shift the meaning of what you're saying, that you don't actually start talking about something else, because the very second you shift the meaning of a word in a deductive argument, the argument becomes invalid. Okay? So you have to pay very close attention to what you're saying, how you're saying it, make sure that's consistent throughout the argument to avoid what's called the fallacy of equivocation. Okay. So as I said, it avoids a bunch of argument about which properties God actually has. We don't have to come up with a definitive list. We don't have to demonstrate each item on that list. And so we can just say this one short descriptive thing. Another crucial innovation or idea that's deployed in Anselm's argument is this idea that if something exists in the imagination, right, that is, you can coherently think of it, that thing is worse than something which exists in the actual world. So think about you're trying to determine who's the greatest detective, right? What's the greatest existing detective? Well, you might think, if you're familiar with English literature, you might say, it's Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes is the greatest detective. Or maybe you think it's Batman, right? Batman is literally called the world's greatest detective in many of the comics and games and such that deal with Batman. So you'd say, it's Batman or it's Sherlock Holmes. Well, neither of those two things, neither of those two people exist. So if there is a detective which has the various properties that they have and also exists in the real world, not just in comic books and stuff, then the one which exists in the real world is better. Even more, something which doesn't have all those properties, because no one can actually do the things that Batman does, and probably no one can do the things that Sherlock Holmes does, even someone who is lesser than them in the sort of qualities, but actually exists, the thing which actually exists is still better. So that's an important assumption that plays a crucial role in the logic of the argument. So, in short, things which exist in the real world are things which are better than imaginary things, right? So, we have here an example of something else that you're going to see a lot throughout the course of the textbook. It's called a reductio ad absurdum. It's called proof by negation, often in mathematical arguments. And what this strategy involves is you assume something which is the opposite of what you actually want to prove. You then show that when you assume the opposite of what you actually want to prove, you get some contradictory statement. And then you say, well, because when you assume this one thing, which is the opposite of what I want to prove, and that thing leads to contradiction, I can now just go straight to what I actually wanted to prove in the first place, right? So this thing that I don't want to be true, if we assume it's true, it leads us to believe stupid things. It leads us, to make stupid conclusions. Because it leads us to make stupid conclusions, it's not true, and therefore the opposite of it, which is what you really wanted to prove all along, that is true. That's how it works. So this occurs in conclusion 2 through conclusion 4 of Anselm's argument. C2 is the opposite of what is meant to be proven, right? So there is something greater than which nothing greater than can be imagined. And so you can see already this statement, aside from the fact that it has this weird phrase in it, there's something weird about this statement. This is basically saying there is something better than the best thing. That's what C2 says. Well, the definition of best is such that nothing can be better than what is best. But C2 is asserting that something is better than what is best. Well, that's just obviously untrue. Because it's obviously untrue, then there is nothing better than what is best. And what is best is something that actually exists. So if God really is best, then God has to exist. That's the sort of TLDR version of this argument. God is the best. Things which don't exist in the real world can't be the best, so God has to exist in the real world. That's the really condensed and kind of roughshod version of Anselm's argument. So that's how it works, and the rest of our discussion is basically going over that kind of stuff. Now this argument is heavily criticized. Okay, so we're not going to bother going through all of these premises bit by bit. Here's our definition of God. Nothing greater can be imagined. And then there's this idea that the greatest things must be existing in real life. Everyone understands this concept. So P4 is interesting. Even the fool understands the concept, something than which nothing greater can be imagined. All that means is that we all can think of something which is the best. Something which there are no other things better than it. We can all think of that. So you don't have to be able to think of God per se. You just have to be able to think of the idea of the best possible thing. Everyone has that idea in their head. Well, he's saying that that idea is just synonymous with, just the same thing as God. So therefore, everyone has the idea of God in their head. Well, if everyone has the idea of God in their head, then God exists in everyone's imagination. But God can't actually be the best thing if he only exists, or if it only exists in everyone's imagination. So God must exist outside of imagination in the real world too. Now, why is this argument sort of heavily criticized? Well, the same structure can be used to prove the existence of all sorts of very bizarre things. So in Anselm's own time, there was I think German, I don't remember, another monk or religious figure who said, look, this argument can be used to prove the existence of a perfect version of anything. Guanilo is the person's name, used this argument. His particular version was to say, I can use this ontological argument to prove the existence of a perfect island, right? Well, the best possible island is only best if it really exists and not only in the imagination. So therefore, the perfect island must really exist. You can see how this is probably, this shows that there's something fishy about the argument. You can keep saying, oh, well, the perfect horse exists. The perfect peanut butter sandwich exists. The perfect, stuffed animal exists. You can make arguments for all of these and prove, just sitting here doing some logic, that these things exist. There's something very suspicious about that. And so, the idea is that there's therefore something suspicious about the argument in general, and it doesn't really prove what it's supposed to. Many hundreds of years later, so in the 1700s, Immanuel Kant, who's extremely influential and famous German philosopher, says, oh, well, what's really wrong with the argument is it treats existence as a property. But existence is not a property. There is nothing which doesn't have existence, right? The thing which everything has is existence. It's not really a property. It's something else. This argument treats this as a property, so the argument is no good. Again, we're not going to get into that too much. These criticisms are mentioned in the textbook. And finally, there's this idea that the argument is circular. I've already mentioned a little bit what a circular argument is. A circular argument is one such that that the premises are connected, that you have in the premise what you're trying to prove in the conclusion. So a trivial, one version of a circular argument would be something like this, and this is a very obvious version. It's raining outside, therefore it's raining outside. That's not an argument. The statement, it's raining outside, doesn't prove that it's raining outside, okay? You're not really making an argument there. That's what a circular argument is, right? When you have, essentially, in your premises, what you are attempting to demonstrate in the conclusion. So then what you end up doing is not really demonstrating the conclusion, but just repeating it, like insisting on it. And a whole bunch of people have said that we're not going to get into how it's circular. It may, it may in the textbook mention a little bit more. So that's what I wanted to go over. I wanted to go over those two arguments, give you a little bit of an idea of how to pick these things apart, how to analyze arguments. And again, you don't have to have gotten it all in this first presentation. We're going to be doing this every week. You'll come to grasp it eventually. And in your group work, you're going to try and sort of amongst yourselves figure out how to do it. You don't have to rely just on understanding my lectures. You're actually going to sort of practice the skills in real life. That's not really what I want to say. Together. You're going to have people help you out. You're going to do it on your own on something where I haven't primed you as to what to say and how to do things. So your first group work argument will be Nietzsche's argument, Friedrich Nietzsche. So he is a 19th century German philosopher, and you've probably heard his name, and what he is most famous for is the so-called death of God argument, which doesn't mean at all what you think it does, I almost guarantee you. So it's not necessarily an argument for atheism, is all I'm going to say. So I've analyzed and criticized these first two arguments. On the basis of what I've shown you, I want you to go and do the same with Nietzsche's argument. So this is the basis for your week 1 active reading assignment, group discussion, and individual summary. So what you want to do is you want to read that chapter, chapter 12, and then you want to do your active reading assignment, which is answer as you read in this kind of, here's what I thought about the answer to this question at the beginning. Here's what I thought by the end. Here's what changed my mind. Make sure to consult the instructions for the active reading assignment. Do that first. Then, once you've done that, go participate in your group discussion. And then finally, on the basis of A and B there, you write your individual summary. And again, please consult the directions for all those separate assignments. It should be pretty clear. Everything should work pretty smoothly. If you have any questions about how to do any of these things, the instructions aren't clear, please do send me an email. If there's anything about any of these slides that you want to ask me, please do send me an email. I think it's possible that through the Integrity software, somewhere down in the viewing panel, there'll be a button for you to ask a question about this part of the lecture. I'm not exactly sure how that works, if I have to do anything extra to make that function available to you, but go ahead and give it a try if you have a question at any point during the lecture, and we'll see if I see those. If I don't, if that doesn't work, then you can, of course, visit me in my office or send me questions by email. Hopefully everyone is having no difficulty viewing these lectures. Remember, the slides are also available for you to look at on your own time, separately from the lecture. They can be downloaded from the lecture materials part of the relevant week. And that's, again, where I will put this recording itself. This recording's run a little bit long. Hopefully I'll get better at making them, not more than an hour, so that, they're kind of like you having to go to lecture once a week. If it's the length of 2 lectures per week, I think that's fine as well. This class isn't structured like, a Monday, Wednesday, Friday, or a Tuesday, Thursday class. So you should definitely get no more than an hour and a half of lecture per week. If it ever goes over that, then I'll have to restructure a little bit. But think of it again as a Monday, Wednesday, Friday thing. You can view 1/3 of the lecture and on one day, another third later, another third later. Just keep in mind that if you do it that way, it might delay your ability to complete the group work assignment on time, because everything for week 1, all the assignments for week 1 are due on September 3rd by 11:59 p.m. That's this coming Sunday by 11:59 p.m. So you need to have finished the active reading assignment, the group discussion, the individual summary, and the quiz. All those need to be done, and to be able to do those in good time, you don't want to put off viewing this lecture for too long. This lecture, I recorded this actually on Sunday, so it will be up all day Monday from the beginning. I will probably hope to do that each week so that you have almost a full 7 days to go through this and watch it, re-watch it if you need to, whatever. So if you have any questions, if you have any troubles that need to be shot with the sort of technical issues here, please let me know. I have linked, of course, in the announcements on the front page for the course site, a link to the Integrity Help for Students. Hopefully those FAQs there will be able to sort you out. If it's not there, I probably can't help you anymore, and we'll have to consult the IT people at ETSU to see if we can sort anything else out. Okay, so we'll be done for now. Again, the next one for week 2 will go up on the 4th of September, and so on and so forth throughout the rest of the course.